Will China succeed where the EU has failed or still failing in Africa? Or will China succeed to put in place a trade and development framework that's going to allow both China and African countries to win? Those are the two questions I'm going to look into in this new episode of the China and Africa debate. Hello, my name is Géraud Neema. I'm the Africa editor of the China Global South Project. And today of this China in Africa debate, I'm going to take you into what may look like the future of Africa-China relationship, especially when you look into trade and development relation. So for those who've been following China and Africa relation, I think that you were quite aware of what happened a few days ago. So a few days ago, we had the ministerial conference of China-Africa that was taking place in Hunan, in the city of Changsha in China. The idea was to gather Chinese officials, basically Chinese Foreign Affairs Minister Wang Yi and his 53 African colleagues, to kind of do an evaluation and look into how the last FOCAC declaration was implemented, what was the process. And it's taking place in a context where there was stark criticism when it comes to about China-Africa relationship, especially around those FOCAC. The criticism was the fact that we don't know how much the FOCAC resolution are implemented over the years, and there was not much of visibility if China really is holding up part of its commitment when those FOCAC declarations are made. So that's why they came up with this ministerial conference to look into how to evaluate how FOCAC declarations are put in place, how they're implemented, and 3 years down the line to be able to say with certainty by how many percent what was promised was actually achieved. But that's not the point of this video. For this video, I'm going to take you into what was one of the headlines that came up out of this Changsha meeting. And I think that many of you have seen those headlines mentioning that China is going to remove tariff for all 53, except the Swatini tariffs to the export to China, allowing all the African countries to be able to export to China free of charge, free of any kind of tariff on China's part. And of course, the reporting of that subject took a different shape and form depending on the country. Some countries were talking about it as China has already decided to do that. Some were much more prudent by saying China is thinking of doing that, and some were just like really much not clear about what was the take out of that resolution. But the point is, in reality, China hasn't decided yet to do it, but China is considering to do that. And I'm gonna read you here what's the exact word that declaration is saying. In this point 8, what's the text is saying? China is ready through negotiating and signing the agreement of China-Africa Economic Partnership for shared development, expand the zero-tariff treatment for 100% tariff line to all 53 African countries having diplomatic relationship with China. All African countries except Eswatini, of course, because Eswatini is the only country in Africa that still recognizes Taiwan as a country, of course, and you could expect that China will not count Eswatini among the countries that are going to benefit that policy, to welcome quality products from Africa to the Chinese market. For the least developed countries in Africa, on top of the zero-tariff treatment for 100% tariff lines announced at the 2024 Beijing Summit of FOCAC, China will roll out measures on market access, inspections and quarantine, and custom clearance to boost trade in goods, enhance skills and technical training, and expand the promotion of quality product. Basically, the resolution here is about China opening up more its market for African product, because when we look into China-Africa relationship, especially when we talk about trade, it's very much unbalanced. First of all, the trade balance is much more is favorable to China, and the trade imbalance is against Africa. So when we look into China-Africa trade basket, realize that most African countries are exporting to China raw materials based on natural resources, minings, timber, whatever you talk about in raw form. But African countries are importing finished product from China, manufactured product, which many African countries are not able to produce to export to China. So those major goals here was basically to say, we are trying, from a Chinese perspective, we are trying to open the market to allow African countries to benefit more from a relationship, because that has been one of the point of contention between China and Africa when it comes to trade, the imbalance of our trade relationship with China. So China, by taking those measures, China wants to open more its market to African product and say, you know what, our market is open. We are open for business for you. But when we look closely at the resolution that was published in Changsha, we realize that it's not just going to be open like this. China is putting in place a condition that many haven't paid attention to, and that's going to be the heart of the topic of our conversation today. When we read again, the resolution start by saying China is ready through negotiating and signing the agreement of China-Africa Economic Partnership for Shared Development. And we realize that this is the main condition. Under that framework, China is ready. China is considering expanding the zero-tariff treatment. And this sentence, the signing of an agreement of China-Africa Economic Partnership for Shared Development, it's not new. It was first time brought up in the last FOCAC. And I think I've mentioned that when I was doing a debrief of the FOCAC, I was hinting to the fact that China has raised an idea that may become that, or that may shape the future of China-Africa relation. And I'm going to read you out of Beijing Declaration that was published last September during the FOCAC, the text the whole text, the whole portion of the text that are talking about that subject. It was point 14, and it's going to be a bit long, but bear with me here. You will understand the context of the discussion we're going to have here. On point 14, on point 14 of the Beijing Declaration, it says like this. We highlight the significance of African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the AfCFTA. We know that that's what Africa is working into putting in place right now. And the full implementation of the AfCFTA agreement will boost Africa's economic development, including through value addition and job creation. China supports Africa in strengthening trade integration and will give continued support to the development of the AfCFTA and the application of the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System. So as you can notice in this part here, we are talking mainly about trade between China and Africa. So China will continue to support African countries in promoting African products through such platforms, including the China International Import Expo and Africa Economic Trade and Trade Expo, and welcome African countries making better use of the Green Lane for African Agriculture Expo to China. The Trade Expo is basically what's happening right now in Changsha, what was happening since few days ago in Changsha. And the ministerial conference I've mentioned was actually happening 2 days before the launch of the 4th China-Africa Trade Expo that's taking place in Changsha. Side note, that expo has been now launched since 2019 and it's becoming a staple in China-Africa relation when we talk about trade. So I continue the text. China is ready to negotiate and sign the framework of China-Africa Economic Partnership for Shared Development with interested African countries. Work for more flexible and practical trade and investment liberalization agreements, and seize the initiative by opening itself wider to African countries so as to provide long-term, stable and predictable institutional safeguard for economic and trade cooperation between China and Africa. China will open its market wider to the least developed countries, including those in Africa, and encourage Chinese business to increase their direct investment in Africa. As you heard it, the thrust of this resolution here that was also brought up in the Changsha resolution is the idea of a China-Africa economic partnership for shared development with interested African countries. Of course, in Changsha, we did not they did not talk about interested African countries, but they alluded to the idea of the country that's going to be interested to sign that agreement with China. China, we're going to expand is a free tariff agreement with that. But we can see here that China is already talking about what I'm comparing. That's why I mentioned if China is going to succeed where the EU has failed, it's basically alluding to what we've seen with the EU ACP agreement. For those who are not familiar with the EU ACP agreement, it's a collective agreement between EU, African country, and Caribbean country that aim to create a development and trade framework where those African countries and the Caribbean countries are going to take advantage of the relationship with the EU to eradicate poverty, to boost development, and to boost political stability and engagement between all the parties engaged in that agreement. The three pillars, before even going deeper, I'm going to go to the three pillars of the ACP agreement. The main pillars of this ACP EU agreement was about trade, politics, and development. And among the trade component to it, we had the EPA agreement. The EPA agreement is the Economic Partnership Agreement between the EU and African countries and also the Caribbean countries. Those who are familiar with that, we had what we called the Lomé Protocol. That started, I think, in 1975 until 2000. And we had the Cotonou Agreement. The Cotonou Agreement that was signed in Cotonou in Benin with the idea of saying what measure we can put in place to allow African countries and Caribbean countries to partner with the EU in a way that we take advantage of the EU market. It was also, when we compare with the language of both the FOCAC declaration and the Changsha declaration, it was pretty much the same idea that China is now putting on the table, opening up the EU markets, allowing African products to take advantage of the EU markets, creating a framework where both parties can talk about development, trade in a way that creates predictability and that boosts development and that boosts trade between the both parties. But when we look into how the EPA agreement between the EU and African countries had worked, or the Caribbean country had worked, there's not much of a success to talk about that. In fact, some would say it was a failure. It's still a failure because after the Cotonou Agreement, we had what we call the post-Cotonou Agreement that was signed in 2023. So after having the Cotonou Agreement, the idea was basically the same between the EU and African countries. It was about creating, as I was saying earlier, the framework of trade that's going to boost African access to the EU market. One of the key elements that we've seen in the EPA agreement was, for example, to mention the fact that the EU will keep its market open free of tariff for African product, but African countries will still maintain a certain level of barrier toward European product imports in the way that to protect certain manufacturing industry in Africa, to protect certain industry from import coming from the EU. But the reality is that convention did not really help that much, because in its implementation, we realized few things that just made it not successful. First of all, in its approach, the EU did not go, in the case of Africa, to all 53 African countries. The EU went into regional blocks. Southern Africa, ECOWAS in Western Africa, Central Africa, MENA region, and all of that. It preferred to go to that process that was an easy way to implement that, believing that it's much more easier to negotiate with grouping of countries than single countries. But when you look into the grouping of countries, you realize that a lot of countries within the grouping of countries did not sign the EP agreement. Some were completely against that, believing that it's going to be disadvantageous to African countries because African countries are going to open the market to EU imported product, and that's not going to help African market at all. In a sense where we don't have manufacturing industry allowing African countries to produce the kind of product that's going to be also used and consumed within the EU market. And that's the issue that we see in China-Africa relationship. It's the same thing. Despite the fact that China has lifted measure for 17 least developed countries in Africa, we realize that those countries still are not taking advantage of that, because the reality is many of them cannot produce the kind of product that are consumed in China because they don't have a manufacturing industry. They don't have the kind of economy that, are producing what Chinese consumer would like. Of course, we have countries like Kenya which are exporting avocado to China. But it's nothing. It's nothing compared to what a real trade would look like if African country were exporting finished good, manufactured good to China, which is not the case. So far. So when you look into the case of the EU has failed. Now China is bringing back a similar idea, and I'm gonna read that to you again. I'm from the FOCAC declaration that says China is ready to negotiate and sign the framework agreement of China-Africa Economic Partnership for shared development with interested African country, work for more flexible and practical trade and investment liberalization arrangement, and seize the initiative by opening itself wider to African countries, which is already doing now by lifting the measure for least developed countries and by considering to lift for all 53 African countries, so as to provide long-term, stable and predictable institutional safeguard for economic and trade cooperation between China and Africa. Predictable institutional safeguard. Basically here, China would like to enter into a framework of institution agreement with African countries that are going to guarantee the trade relationship within China and Africa, with China and Africa, but also to create a space where Chinese investments are going to be safe and protected in African countries. And this is very important because it comes in a context where we have geopolitical tension happening in the world, and we see those tensions now creating a space of tension where Chinese company may be targeted by certain interests, and they don't want that. On the side note, those who've been following, you know that China has put in place few weeks ago, the International Organization for Mediation in Hong Kong, where China is promoting mediation, and it's really promoting a new way of dealing with with business dispute that are taking place in different parts of the world. I did a video on that. You can see and check what that organization is about. But all of that, it's part of a mechanism, a context where China wants to create a context where its investment in Africa, its trade relationship with Africa, its development relationship in Africa are now under a institution framework between the both parties. And that institution is not FOCAC, because FOCAC is not an institutional framework that's provide those kind of guarantee. But China is willing and thinking to go in that direction. So this is the idea that we are seeing right now. It's basically China trying to mimic what the Cotonou Agreement or what the EU ACP agreement was with the EU and African countries and Caribbean countries. So the question is, will China actually succeed with African countries? Will China really succeed where the EU has failed, and I say is still failing to put that in place? So far, we don't have many guarantee to that, because I'm going to raise a few points here. Since the FOCAC and since the Changsha Declaration, I haven't seen on the continent any African countries, any African government picking up on the idea of China is talking about an economic partnership, for shared development with interested African countries. China is talking about a framework where all of us are going to be all together in a framework of development and trade. What can we do about that? I don't see any debate about that. I don't see any discussion taking place around that topic. But yet, China has put that again on the table. This time in Changsha, when talking about that, lifting expanding the zero tariff for all 55 African countries, I thought that this time it's going to get the attention of African leaders to say, you know what, China is proposing that, but it's also proposing a framework where this kind of policy can take place. But I haven't seen any pickup from African countries in that direction. First point. Second point, when we look into history, we look into how African countries have been dealing with those kind of measures, especially in the case of the EU. We've seen that many African countries were reluctant to sign those kind of agreement with the EU because they were looking into the market, believing that, we are not strong enough. We don't have manufacturing landscape. We don't have anything that's going to allow us to take advantage of that. But us opening up our market, even though it's not the same way the EU is going to open to us, but us opening up our markets to EU product will just hurt us more because they will just take advantage of that. And mind you, we are talking about the EU here. In the case where in the situation where the EU is producing high-end product that's really quite expensive. But now try to imagine when you put that with China, given that even without those kind of measure, China export to Africa is made of manufactured good. And the majority of the manufactured good consumed in Africa are coming from China, beating up the local production. And many European imported product cannot compete with China's product are offering in African market. We had the case of in Kenya where there is this China supermarket where people are complaining that how China is importing. Now Chinese are selling product they're importing from China, beating and competing unfairly to Kenyan businessmen, to local businessmen. So we see the similar context in many African countries where the end product coming from China are still cheaper, are still more affordable than product coming from other part of the world, and they're still cheaper than product produced in many African countries. And because of that, because of those import from China, many African countries have stopped producing some of the product they could have produced themselves if they were not having to deal with import coming from China of manufactured goods. So we have that context. Now, when we see that, the question becomes like, will African country be willing where they were not willing for European product that was more expensive? Would they be ready to sign those kind of agreement with China, knowing that they're going to open the markets to Chinese product that's going to even hurt the industry more? Third point, it's going to also, by doing that, they also now may hurt their own revenues, fiscal revenues, because many African countries depend basically on the tariff they have on imports. So try to imagine signing an agreement with China, large manufacturer, the largest producer of manufactured product in the world, the largest, market in the world, flooding your market and saying, we are deciding to stop to put tariff on those products. It's going to be billions of dollars of loss for many African countries, and I don't see them being willing to negotiate, to go into those kind of agreement, because what we should be expecting from China will, of course, by opening up its market, it will expect the similar measure to be put in place in many African countries. And just like the EU, China might be willing to say, you know what, you're going to take it step by step. If I'm completely open, African countries can take it step by step by going gradually into that process within a certain time frame. That was the same thing with the EU, but yet even there, African countries still did not open, still did not sign. In the case of China, if something similar happened, we can anticipate that similar position will also be taken by African government not willing to open the market. So as I was saying, China will expect that. Beyond the trade, China might say, I understand your concern, but I believe that if we open our market, we're going to both benefit from that. But I don't really see how African countries are going really to be open to that idea. The fourth point I can mention here that can really stop African country, not putting African country in a state where they're not really willing to move forward with that idea, is the AfCFTA, because the AfCFTA is taking place. The African countries are willing and are working on how they're going to build up that process, how they're going to build that free trade market between them, how they're going to open Africa to make it a whole market. While they're discussing that, how are they reconciling that with the idea of opening the whole African country, the whole African market to Chinese product, knowing that by doing that, it may hurt some big economy like South Africa and Nigeria, which has some good and solid manufacturing landscape, but it may benefit to other countries which do not have a strong manufacturing landscape. So having that in place, we should be expecting there will be disagreement within African countries, within regional organization on how to approach that question. Some would say we're not ready to go that way. Some would say, it's too risky for us. Just like with the EU ACP agreement, it's expected to see the same situation happening with China. But what it will take to China to be able to convince and to persuade African countries to be part of that agreement? And this is the part where China can have a certain leverage to put on the table. We've been mentioning the fact that African countries do not have a strong manufacturing landscape. So is it possible for African countries now, through an agreement like that, to create a framework where China is going to export toward Africa, is going to export manufacturing industry? China is going to invest into manufacturing industry in Africa. That China is going really to be to be that actor that's going to help African countries to build the industrial landscape. Will this kind of disposition being able to be negotiated through those kind of agreements? I can hear from here Chinese saying that we are willing to do that. We are willing to accompany African country into industrialization, into developing to manufacture landscape. We've said that since FOCAC that we are ready to be that partner for Africa. And they're going to also say that in the resolution I've read, they say we want to create provide a long-term, stable and predictable institutional safeguard for economic and trade cooperation. It means that we are willing to do that as long as there are contexts, there are safeguards that's put in place that can protect our investment in those African countries. So those are the kind of leverage that China can put on the table by saying that we are willing to export some of our manufacturing into Africa. We are willing to help that. And it's going to come in a very interesting moment now that we are talking about value addition, local value addition in critical minerals, in the mining sector in general. We are seeing that happening in Africa. So there is an opportunity there where China can say, I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to put that on the table. If it's allowing you to develop your own industrial landscape, if it allows you to build your own manufacturing industry, we are willing to do that as long as we do create the context for that to take place. So when I think of all of that, I realize that yes, China may succeed, may have the element to put on the table. But the second element to consider onto the success of that kind of idea is like how China is going to approach that. Is it going to take the same routes that the EU has taken by saying, I'm not going to negotiate with individual African countries, I'm going to negotiate with grouping of countries, with regional economic committees like the SADC, the ECOWAS, the CAC, all those regional bodies. Am I going to take that route, or am I going to take the bilateral approach? So far, China has shown that interest for bilateral trade, bilateral approach instead of a collective approach. But in this case, if China goes through the bilateral route, it's maybe disadvantageous in a sense where if China wants market, China wants the African market, some small countries do not represent much for China. Which means that in that logic, some countries will be losing, small market will be losing in a sense where China will not have any incentive into creating that kind of those kind of agreements with them, because there's not much anything to get from those countries. But at the same time, it's also going to benefit some bigger countries that are going to say, you know what, we may benefit us by signing those agreements with China. But themselves, those bigger countries may find themselves also in danger, given the fact that because they are big, they are large economy, they are much more bigger in terms of industrial in manufacturing, so they can also feel threatened for import coming from China. So it's a very complex balance here that China is going to have to take into account into how they are approaching this idea, how they intend to implement it with African countries, which route they're going to take, which leverage they're going to put on the table, which incentive, and maybe I'm not going to use the word leverage, but incentive, which incentive they're going to offer to put on the table African countries to say, you know what, we better work together into creating this development, economic trade development framework that's going to allow us to both win. That's the question I've asked in the beginning. Will China succeed where the EU has failed? Will China be able to put in place a framework a development and economic framework that's going to benefit both China and African countries? The skeptical part of me is saying, given the nature of China-Africa relationship, given the economic imbalance, given the imbalance in the economic profile, I'm really doubting that that's going to be really the case. A powerful country, a big country like China will always have the upper hand unless African countries change their approach and negotiate differently. Is it going to be the opportunity for the AU Commission or the African Union to say, you know what, let's boost the AfCFTA and allowing us now to negotiate through that framework? Or is it going to be, each country for its own and trying to move forward and to make it win with China? So this basically was the idea I wanted to put forward in this China and Africa debates to allow us to think what's the future of China-Africa relationship would look like tomorrow. So it was a pleasure to have you in this China and Africa debate. And as I say, my name is Géraud Neema. I'm the Africa editor of the China Global South. So if you like what you see, don't hesitate to click the subscribe button and the notification bell so you're going to be informed every time we drop a new video on this channel. On this channel, we cover China engagement in the Global South. We have a podcast, the China and Africa podcast. We have a series of content that we do produce around Chinese activities in the Global South. And I can tell you, you won't be disappointed by the content that we put forward here. So that was all for me. I'm gonna see you next time for another China in Africa debate.